Stormcloaks.
As fearless in death as he was in life.
Next, the Nord and the Rags.
There it is again. Did you hear that?
You bet your sweet bippy I did.
I am done with freshman year. Yes. Welcome world builders, Elder Scrolls fans, and other cool people. You are watching a look at how the geography and environment of the fantasy continent Tamriel would affect its countries and empires. Some of you may already be thinking, hey, what's the point of going so in-depth about a fantasy video game thing? Welcome to this world building channel. Looking at how unrealistic and obviously fantasy continents would realistically function based on its land and environment can be enlightening for GMs, writers, and world builders for making consistent and believable worlds. That being said, I'm not here to explain the broad and narrow Elder Scrolls lore. Look here if you're interested in those. How would the people on these lands fight each other? Where would the centers of power be? Who would fight who? And would each province be able to unify like in this classic map? Let's get to it. High Rock. High Rock is a very funky place because it's a big peninsula that just sticks out of the land on top of Hammerfell. With High Rock's shape, I think there would be a big power at its tip because this is largely flat. It's productive, it's mostly forest like in the Daggerfall map, and most importantly, a power at the tip would only have to worry about land invasions from one side of the border. If there were to be a power like Daggerfall here, it would first want to extend out like that and then push up the peninsula like this. That way, it only has to worry about land invasions from one side, and it would be relatively easy to defend, as opposed to something like this right here, which is the Shalgora. As opposed to the Shalgora region right here, all it would take is two powers to decide to attack it at once, and it really wouldn't be able to do anything about it. A power at the tip of High Rock would not have that problem. That's not to say that it's the only place where a power could arise, but it's realistic that one would arise right there. Now, up in the north of High Rock, there's more mountains. This being a mountainous place with valleys and forests, it reminds me a lot of Japan. Now, the world building geography we see there is that those mountains are not very fertile and not very productive. So what ends up happening is there's a bunch of separate places with high population densities, and therefore there's a bunch of disparate centers of power there. Until somebody comes along and unifies it, of course. This is more in line with how the game shows it, although I find it kind of unrealistic that it decides not to have any polities in the mountains themselves, because there have often been kingdoms and things that have existed inside of mountain ranges, like the Shishia, or Armenia. One big thing that any polity at High Rock has to worry about is Hammerfell. The Iliac Bay kind of acts as the center of this world, because it would easily facilitate travel and invasion. Even though amphibious invasion is difficult, it's very possible. William the Conqueror, Canute, not the Mongols, they got wiped. Because of this, High Rock and the northern part of Hammerfell would interact with each other pretty often. Whether it's trade, invasion, people going across, they would be familiar with each other. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a High Rock Empire in Hammerfell, and vice versa. Durrani hegemony! And because the proximity of the two powers gets closer together as you go up northeast in the coast, it wouldn't be surprising to find influence of the other on either side. So could High Rock form a united province? Yeah, I think so, but it might fall apart right after and go back to like in the game. Hammerfell. Hammerfell is unique, not just because I think it would be the best place for the Elder Scrolls 6, I can't wait, but I would consider that it's split into 3 different geographical regions. The north will be more influenced by High Rock, and the more northeast you go, the closer you get to this river, the more that will be true. The south is mostly desert and steppe, and the northeast kind of reminds me of the Tarim Basin in the northwest of China and where about Tajikistan is. The northeast of Hammerfell's border will be especially influenced by the Bretons because it seems to be a forest like in this map of Daggerfall, which is the same environment that the people in High Rock are used to. And people tend to be more effective ruling and fighting in an environment like their own home. They're more used to it. The western part that is on the Alakir Desert will kind of be affected, but who knows? I'm looking forward to the next game. Then there's the northeast part of Hammerfell, which is mostly mountains, deserts, and dry steppes. Because of that, it reminds me of the northwest part of China, the Tarim Basin, which is basically the same environmental layout, which has given rise to pretty isolated kingdoms like the Sogdians. Because of that, I don't think this place will be home to a large power center, but it will have its own kingdom controlling its own people. I don't think it has much to worry about from Skyrim because it has the mountains to its north and the Geral Mountains to its east, so it's mostly protected from the people in Cyrodiil too. And then there's the southern part. Most of the maps and everything that I've seen pit this part of Hammerfell as a big plains area, with some mountains at the southern part of it. That's in line with having a desert right here, a great forest right here, and the Gold Coast also being plains. Because it's a large stretch of plains going all the way down here, I think that horse riders could dominate this section of the map. These two sections of geography could make it a little difficult because the Colovian Highlands, as shown in Oblivion, are very rocky, very mountainous, and forested, which is not the best place for horse riders to go through. But coming down here to the coast, it's a lot more flat and it's a plains. So I think that the potential horse riders could pinch through here and come down to the Gold Coast and Cyrodiil and control this entire area like that. Perhaps it's up to the Alakir Desert, perhaps it's down to the Gold Coast, and even into Reaper's March and the desert and elsewhere, because Reaper's March, as seen in ESO, looks kind of savanna-like, which I think horse riders could take over pretty easily. It's kind of far-fetched to say that the horse riders would go all the way down here without any problem, because as it comes down here, it starts to become more surrounded by different people. And lastly, Hughesbane. As Elder Scrolls Online shows it, it's a desert, it's weird, I don't know. Perhaps it would be its own isolated thing because it's protected from the outside by this sea, and it would only have to defend this little part of land. But depending on how the people around it, cough cough, Summerset Isles, decide to feel about it, they could probably go in and take it too. Who knows? So could Hammerfell unify entirely? Soft no. It's super diverse with different enemies from all sides, but never say never. Yeah, never ever. Cyrodiiiiil. On the border of Cyrodiil and Hammerfell, there are the Colovian Highlands. These are hills that are rocky and forested. Because it's big and it's highlands that are above the rest of the area around it, I don't think it's out of the picture that this place could be dominated by a state that arises out of the highlands. Sometimes highlands are very good for controlling the people around you, because it's hard to penetrate into them because you're always fighting uphill. One example of this is the kingdom of Axum that existed in the Ethiopian highlands, which came to dominate the surrounding area as well as the trade that went through there. Because of that, I think there could be a pretty powerful kingdom in the Colovian Highlands themselves, especially if it's along this river, which would be good for production and agriculture. Now, the south of Cyrodiil is pretty vulnerable. It can be invaded from both sides of the Nimid River, and the only geographical features that protect the center of power in Cyrodiil are these rivers. Rivers, in order for them to work as defensive boundaries, need to be heavily fortified with patrols going up and down them to make sure that there's no funny business going on the other side. You can cross a river secretly, you know. For an example of this, look at both the Rhine and the Danube frontiers of the Roman Empire. By the end of it, they were both heavily fortified to deal with Germanic invaders. While these rivers are good boundaries for Cyrodiil, they're still very expensive to maintain. That is in line with the lore that's set up in Skyrim, you know? Because Cyrodiil needs to defend from people in the south and potentially also the west, the only place I find extremely secure are the north and northwest corners that are on the Geral Mountains and the Valus Mountains. Mountains are probably the best geographical feature for defense, because it's very difficult to cross them, and if there's only certain mountain passes that go through them, it's pretty easy to defend, because choke points. Because of that, I don't think Skyrim would be able to mount an effective invasion into Cyrodiil, nor Morrowind. Honestly, why would they want to? It's often very difficult to maintain territory on the other side of a mountain range. This section of Cyrodiil would be the only one that doesn't have a bunch of influence from the other powers. Now looking at the central part of the entire continent of Tamriel, you have the Imperial City and the gigantic Niben River, which I'm kind of convinced is actually an inlet, but whatever. Big rivers like this can often be a factor that centralizes a state. Like the Nile and Mississippi rivers. You can control trade and you can move troops around very easily, so in big rivers you can get large powers. For the Nile River, Egypt, for the Mississippi River, you have the Mississippi Culture Complex, which is a bunch of similar cultures around the Mississippi River Valley, because it's easy to travel along these rivers. The Niben River here in the middle is very much the same, however, in the north, it's surrounded by these Cyrodiiiiil people, and in the south, it's potentially surrounded by people from elsewhere and Black Marsh, and people, Khajiit and Argonians, which, if you ask the Dunmer, they're just farming tools. In the lore, elsewhere, Black Marsh and Cyrodiiiiil do vie a lot for this lower river valley, and rightfully so. If you have access to this particular choke point, the city of Leoween, then you could cut off trade from the outside with all of these parts. And you could also let in any kind of attackers that you want to. For that reason, I think Elsewhere would definitely want this part, and Black Marsh would definitely want this part. But in the games so far, the Empire has been in control, and the Empire is in Cyrodiiiiil, so it makes sense that Cyrodiiiiil would take these different places. The Bethesda writers did take into account a lot of different factors. Controlling the Niben River would be a pretty big priority for any power that arises in Cyrodiiiiil. Other than that, a united Cyrodiiiiil could exist if it controls the entirety of this river valley, and then it could stretch itself out to be on the Gold Coast, so it has trade with the Abatian Sea. And I love how that's S-E-E here. So could Cyrodiiiiil unify like in the game?
No! No!
Just kidding, it could, but it would be hard. Elsewhere. Elsewhere is a very funky place on Tamriel. As said before, it is right on the Niben River and has access to the Topal Bay, so it probably has a natural power base just controlling the Niben River and up here. Aside from that, it has the disadvantage of being in contest with Valenwood and the south of Cyrodiiiiil. When you look at in the game, this edge of the Niben River, right next to Elsewhere, is all forest, which essentially means that the desert in Elsewhere exists as a pocket in a very large complex of jungles and forests that extends all the way up into southern Cyrodiiiiil. Elsewhere, having this desert could be a disadvantage because deserts are harsh, they're not easy to live in, and they're not good for agriculture. And because this one's in the middle of all these forests, it doesn't act as a barrier for anything. However, this desert could also be a positive thing because moving around in the jungles and forests is a very difficult thing to do, especially for large amounts of troops, for big trade caravans, anything like that. So because this desert exists in the pocket of the forest, there needs to be a large transitionary ring around it that isn't just desert or forest, but plains. These plains could be productive with animals, with trade, and with moving around war caravans, so perhaps this desert would be a very strategic thing to hold on to if you wanted to control a large region of Elsewhere and Valenwood, and even into southern Cyrodiiiiil. Once again, it's easier to control an environment that is like your own. So an empire that exists in the forests of Elsewhere could extend itself into the forests of Valenwood and Cyrodiiiiil, although it might have a lot of trouble in the desert region of Elsewhere. Being on the Niben River, Elsewhere could also extend itself across into Blackwood and maybe threaten Black Marsh, but that's only if it's very powerful and unified. So could Elsewhere form like on the map, with just the desert in the north and the jungle in the south? Don't think so, because those two environments are kind of opposites. But there could be powerful states around here that are based off of that dynamic. Valenwood. Valenwood is kind of it's kind of just a blob of forests, you know? Because Valenwood doesn't have a lot of diversity in its environment, I think it could be unified, but it could also just exist as a bunch of separate states that are divided by this thick-ass forest. However, if somebody from the outside tried to penetrate into Valenwood, the forest and jungle in it would provide very good protection for guerrilla fighters. Because of that, I don't think it would be easy for anyone outside of Valenwood to colonize them, but they could certainly try. There are rivers that go through it, which could be important in controlling it. I think if there were to be a center of power for a unified Valenwood, it would have to be from the center, because I think the rivers that flow through it would originate in the very middle, which gives it access to project its power on the edges. So could Valenwood form a united province? Yeah, absolutely. But being a giant land of forests, it could also form a bunch of separate entities. Summerset Isles. The Summerset Isle is an island.
Wow!
Even if it's all just a big fantasy woodland like ESO shows it. Being an island makes it have very definite confines, which makes unifying the entire thing a pretty obvious geopolitical goal. Maybe the island would pull a united kingdom and have a unified polity on its own big island, and then take a small chunk of Aradon, but I think the Summerset Isle would be able to dominate a lot of things around it. And this is especially because the Navy is going to be paramount to the geopolitical strategy of anybody on these islands. The only threat a polity here would face, besides internal rebellion or discontent or anything, would be outside invasion from these different powers of the Abatian Sea. And if anyone tried to invade, they would have to use big boats, and the best way to fight big boats is have more bigger boats. So the Summerset Isle would definitely want to invest in a big navy. To project power, the Summerset Isle would want to take all these small little islands around and kind of claim the Abatian Sea as its own. Aside from that, having its capital on the west part of the island is good, because any other power trying to take over the island would have to go around or fight its way through the island in order to reach the capital. And that only works if you have a giant brass god on your side. So could the Summerset Isle form a united polity? Most definitely yes. And I think it would even go as far to colonize areas around it. Skyrim. Skyrim is completely surrounded by giant, hard-to-cross mountains, and there's only a few places where you'll be able to cross into the other provinces. This makes it very easy to defend from outside invasion, but that kind of security can give way to people just hating each other on the inside instead. It being super cold and super north, and also super mountainous, doesn't bode well for the productivity of the area. Any conflicts inside of Skyrim would probably have to be small scale, otherwise it may devastate everything. The landmass in Skyrim is really separated into two different basins, one on the left and one on the right, and you can get across from one to the other through different mountain passes or near this river next to Whiterun. Because of this, I think the geographical split of the Stormcloaks and the Imperials makes a lot of sense. The Stormcloaks exist on the east and the Imperials on the west, and Whiterun is a big strategic important place for them. Skyrim could be divided like this, but it could also be very easily unified because the entire thing is just a big basin of the surrounding mountains. When it comes to controlling Skyrim, I think the most important part would be this middle plain of Whiterun, because plains are easy to move troops around if you control them, and this plain in particular ends right where the West Basin moves into the East Basin with this river. Even though there are passes that you can go around, those would be relatively easy to defend, and this one being wider with a river going through it makes a big difference. Now the problem with Skyrim is that if it wants to exert any international influence, it has to control these passes and then push through them in order to go anywhere. Could Skyrim form a united province like in the classic map? Absolutely. Bonus round. If based on the geography alone, who will win the Skyrim Civil War? It depends on who gets Whiterun. Haha. Black Marsh. Black Marsh is a giant swamp. Marsh and swamp usually suck to live in because it's hard to move around, it's hard to transform the environment, and they're usually filled with nasty, gross disease. Swamp and marsh are also transitionary zones between land and water, so realistically, a marsh like this could never exist, but that's okay, because it's a fantasy continent. So on the conditions that only Argonians could prosper and empire build from here, what is Black Marsh's geopolitical situation? Black Marsh could pretty easily invade into Cyrodiiiiil, especially since this is marsh around here, and if it controls these hills around here, it would be much harder for the people in Cyrodiiiiil to mount a defense against them. The same goes for southern Morrowind, as that's all swamp, and there are hills that they could use to control the surrounding area. Morrowind poses a significant threat because of its closeness to Black Marsh. The biggest thing about Black Marsh is, because it's a giant marsh, it would be basically impossible for anybody but Argonians to invade into it, making it completely safe for the swamp-based reptilians that live in its core. So the Argonians of Black Marsh could take an offensive advantage if they controlled the hills around the core area of Black Marsh. And if Black Marsh was so inclined, they could easily invade across the Niben River into elsewhere, or up the Niben River to take up here. So could Black Marsh form a united province? Only the Argonians could do it. Morrowind. Morrowind on its west side is very protected by mountains, and on its east side has a giant ocean that will only be a problem if the continent on the other side of it decides to invade. So for the internal aspects of Morrowind's power, how would one control it? Well, looking at this concept map for Morrowind, we can see a few things. A central polity in Morrowind could exert power using the navy in this inland sea. With that, it could control any coastal settlements and have a power base that extends all the way up to the northern coast. If there were a central polity in Morrowind, I think it would exist right here in the very center. This is because there are rivers that originate there, that it can once again exert power through those to a lot of the settlements. And if we're accepting this concept map for the mainland of Morrowind, because the island of Valenwood is looking terrible, they could also control this central plain, which would give them access to about this area. So I think a central Morrowind state could exist. However, the further away you get from the coast and the higher up you get, the harder it might be to maintain control, which means that the inland in Valenwood might be compromised to rebels, and the highlands on either branch pointing north might be difficult for them to control.
So could Morrowind form a unified province? Yeah, hail on Civi.
These aren't critiques of the map, nor the world building in the Elder Scrolls games. This map is just very simple and easy to understand. Each playable race comes from one distinct province, except the orcs, because they're outcasts. Does this mean we now know who will win the Skyrim Civil War? What about the Elder Scrolls 6 Redfall Daggerguard? No, nothing about any of that. I just wanted to look at some whack-ass, fake fantasy geography and see what it might mean for geopolitics and world building. So join the Discord and give this video a dislike. Peace.